All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for coming to this webinar, which is on distance learning. This is a kind of intentionally a timely topic, as so many of us have started school or are starting school really recently and doing some version of distance learning, or we might have to start distance learning in the future here. So I will share screen and kind of talk through the points that are on the screen, but at any time, if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. And Truman is also on the line here, who is helping to moderate and produce this webinar. So if I don't see your questions, Truman, feel free to jump in with them as well. So I'm Dr. Jessica Robnazant. I'm a clinical psychologist here with Oliver Behavioral Consultants, and I'm really grateful and pleased to be here and to talk with you about distance learning for this webinar. As many of you know, and kind of what I want to cover with this webinar is some of the challenges, but also the advantages that distance learning has. And for those of us, you know, in the throes of distance learning right at this moment, thinking about any advantages can sometimes be hard, but I wanted to give a little airtime to talking about them. Because when we're in the throes of something that's stressful, and certainly distance learning can be stressful, it's hard to take notice of the advantages. But being mindful of what those advantages are can help us to feel a little more balanced as we go through this journey. But in addition to just kind of the general challenges and advantages, I also want to think through how we can support our own distance learners, so our kids, and hopefully shift the balance a little bit so that we end up with more ticks in the advantages column. And then lastly, I want you to come away from this webinar feeling like you have maybe a little bit of guidance or advice or tips on how to navigate or think about what really is a very unique learning experience that we're all faced with. Okay, so before going on further, I want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page with some key terms. So as I use them later, we know what we're talking about. So when we talk about distance learning, we could actually mean a host of just different things. Right now, for most of us that are involved in public schooling, we are doing some version of what's called remote learning. Remote learning is different than online education. Online education is an educational product or program that from its inception, from the start, was intended to be delivered online. So the platforms that one may use, the tools that one may use to enable learning or to facilitate learning likely look quite different than what remote learning is. Remote learning is intended to emulate a traditional learning experience, but it's provided remotely. So one thing that you could do to draw an analogy is to say, if I were to be giving this presentation in front of a classroom, and instead you're just watching it right now online, that's in some ways like what remote learning is like. Versus online education would be like if I had multiple different platforms that I was using to try to provide information in a different way. So maybe I had podcasts and videos and an interactive type of learning tool. And as I'm talking through that would have been really cool, and maybe that'll be our next webinar. But I do want to draw that distinction because a lot of families right now are, in some ways, whether they're being conscious of it or not, are trying out remote learning. So they're trying out the normal, typical public school experience or charter school experience, as opposed to intentionally choosing an online education platform or online education program. So a program that was developed to be and only delivered online. Remote learning is kind of a stopgap for what is intended to be going back to kind of a traditional schooling. A couple other terms that I want you to be familiar with, just so we're all on the same page when we use them later, is synchronous versus asynchronous learning. For those of us that are doing remote learning, we probably have by force become familiar with these terms, but what synchronous learning means is like what's happening right now for the live audience. We are experiencing the content simultaneously. So I'm giving it to you, you are receiving it all at the same time. We are logged into the same platform at the same time. Asynchronous is going to be for everybody that's watching this after the fact, meaning this is going to be a webinar that stands alone and you can watch later, but we are not necessarily logged on at the same time. I won't be able to answer people who watch this later their questions live. It can also mean that I'm doing an independent activity without the guidance of a teacher or an educator to craft, guide, or answer questions for me. Hybrid or blended education, I'm jumping down here to the end, is a combination of synchronous and asynchronous learning via an online platform. So this might be you have some components of your education delivered synchronously, some asynchronously. It can also mean, and kind of more traditionally means, that you have part of your education delivered face-to-face and the other part is delivered to you online. And then lastly, home learning and homeschooling. This is when a person opts out of public schooling and instead intends to provide education to their identified student, who is most typically a family member, independently. They may use things like state standards as a guide, but there is quite a bit more flexibility in when and for how long and the type of content that is covered with a home learning or homeschooling experience. And so, you know, everybody that's watching this webinar might have a different variation therein. So when we talk about distance learning, I'm going to try and present strategies, advantages, things like that, kind of cover the spectrum to make sure that we're not leaving any particular type of schooling out of the mix. Okay, so distance learning advantages and disadvantages. So right now, in this moment, one of the key advantages of distance learning is that as a community and as individuals, we have some increased safety from this novel coronavirus that we all are dealing with. Many people opt for distance learning, and this preceded the time of COVID. And some of us will stay with distance learning long after the time of COVID, but it does offer some increased safety from this kind of current contemporaneous risk that we have. And I think that's something important to keep in mind. Some other advantages is that our morning pressures, our morning routines, it's not as though those pressures aren't there anymore, but the pressure valve has been released a little bit. For many of us, our commutes have been eliminated or shortened entirely, and so we are reclaiming some time that would have been spent in commuting to school or to work. For many of our kids, and I think this is a really important one, the home environment can be less stressful than the school environment. The school environment, and I'm not saying that to bag on schools at all, but you put a lot of people in a building, and that comes with a lot of different values and a lot of different intentions. And for many of our kids, they've had to deal with things like bullying or kind of sensory overload. And so in those respects, the home environment can actually be a bit more supportive and less stressful. That is not the case, of course, for all of our kids, but for those of us that have some control over our home environment, we can be intentional about making it less stressful than the alternative. And so in some ways that can be empowering for families. We have a unique opportunity for those of us that are home with our kids to enable self-sufficiency with some monitoring. If self-sufficiency and independence is a goal, that is a goal that we can help our kids at least make some movement towards, with being intentional with how we respond to their needs. So we want to provide some monitoring, but we can also do this in a way that we can strategically build up their sense of autonomy. And I'll cover this a little bit today, but also for those of you that are going to join the webinar in a couple of weeks with Dr. Sarah Jenkins, she's going to talk about a specific strategy called behavioral contracting, and we'll get into this in even more detail. And she's got some awesome ideas and suggestions. We have another advantage of time management. So again, with some of the reduced pressures from getting to and from school, and particularly with our asynchronous time blocks, we can have a little bit more control over our own personal time management. And this is also an opportunity for some personal growth, both from ourselves and also from our children. The disadvantages are obvious. I'm still going to go through them though to make sure I'm giving balance to both sides. Our kids are less socially connected, and we are less socially connected than we were 6 months ago. And that is a real, meaningful, powerful disadvantage. And it's something a lot of people are struggling with. As a clinical psychologist, one of the things I deal with day in and day out is people's wellness and mental health. And this decrease in ability to connect socially is having a toll on people, and it is a real disadvantage. Another disadvantage is we kind of lose what we call a point of performance correction. When we are doing things in person and synchronously, there's that naturalistic opportunity to say like, oh, that was a really great, positive, pro-social example of fill in the blank. And we can catch it and reinforce it and strengthen it, try to increase the likelihood of it happening again. We also miss the flip, which is when we make a mistake, either behaviorally or academically, saying, oh, see what you're doing there, but actually it's this, and correcting it before mistakes become habits. And kind of losing that is tough on a lot of kids. And so this might be an area where some families opt to step in and provide some more point of performance correction. Sorry for that tongue twister. Another disadvantage, and I think this is true for both kids and teens as well as adults, is that boundaries are getting blurred. A lot of times, kind of the environment offer this natural cue of it's not school time now, it's home time, or it's not work time, it's home time. And doing distance learning or working from home, those boundaries become far more blurred, and it's sometimes hard to set some boundaries up, even though that may be necessary for ourselves or necessary for our kids. It's a harder task to do, and it's something to be mindful of and attend to. It can sometimes be less motivational. Certainly distance learning requires self-motivation. And when our kids don't have that, then we kind of have to step in and be that motivator for good or bad. But for many of our kids, it's less kind of inherently, or what we would call intrinsically motivating. Certainly not true for all of them, but for a good piece, that is the case. Some of our kids may really be experiencing a decline in their oral language skills or their social skills, or more broadly, kind of their communicative skills. And that is a big concern that families have with distance learning. And if that's something that your family is experiencing, I would really encourage you to not hope that it'll just recover on its own, but to be intentional about seeking out opportunities for them to practice those social skills, even if it looks different than the norm, or to practice those oral language skills, those communication skills, so they're not regressing. And then lastly, the dreaded technical difficulties, which I am crossing my fingers and knocking on wood right now. We don't have any of those of our own, but these feel like these out of control blips that just make the connection all the harder to sustain. Okay, so everything I just ran through, the advantages, the disadvantages, they're very real. But at the end of the day, one thing that is heartening to remember is that distance learning is a set of behaviors. There's many small behaviors that go into successfully learning via the computer or doing distance learning. But they are just behaviors, and they are under the influence of the same principles of behavior that govern our in-person interactions. And I suspect many of you have heard of or are familiar with the ABCs of behavior and learning. This comes from social learning theory. What social learning theory is, it is an explanation for how behaviors, and particularly social behaviors, develop and then maintain over time. And so distance learning is, by virtue, less social for sure, but it is still a learning opportunity. And so learning theory, our explanation of how kids and adults learn, still holds true. And so a good way of summarizing and remembering social learning theory is to remember the ABCs of behavior. And what the ABCs of behavior stands for are antecedents, that's the A, behaviors is the B, and consequences is the C. So ABC, antecedent, behavior, consequence. And what we know is that the B, the behaviors, are influenced by both antecedents and consequences. The antecedents are what comes before, what sets the stage. My favorite example for remembering antecedents is looking at a stoplight, a traffic light. When I drive up to a traffic light and I see the light is green, nothing forces me to drive through that light. I am making the choice to do so, but gosh, if that antecedent, that green light, doesn't influence my behavior, I bet you 10 times out of 10 times, I drive through a green light because I've got, or historically, I had places to go and people to see. Not really true anymore, but you catch my drift. The red light, conversely, tells us that traffic is going to be stopping. Again, nothing forces me to push on my brakes and stop my car, except for that cue. And that cue tells me that, hey, if you want to avoid a wreck or a ticket, this is something you ought to do. So a traffic light is a really powerful antecedent. It tells me very clearly what my expected behaviors are, to go, to slow down, or to stop. Consequences are things that occur after the behavior. And they either strengthen the likelihood that behavior is going to happen again in the future, or they punish, meaning they reduce the likelihood or eliminate the likelihood that this behavior is going to happen again in the future. So reinforcers are things that increase the behavior, and punishment is things that decrease the behavior. Now, if you are like me, as a parent, there are probably certain things that you do that you really hope are punishers, meaning you hope when you put them in place, your kids like cut it out and they don't do that behavior ideally ever again, or at least not very frequently. But one of the things that's really important to think about when we're thinking about these consequences is that if a behavior is increasing, regardless of what it is we're doing, we are somehow strengthening or reinforcing that behavior. If the behavior is decreasing, regardless of what it is that we're putting into place or what we intend, we got to look at what's actually happening, then we are effectively punishing it. And I'm going to get into some examples of this in a moment. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to come back to this one before I get there. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to use a little bit of a personal example that I dealt with today, just to kind of drive this point home. So my own child is doing distance learning, and it has been an adventure. And today was one of those days that my kiddo really decided that they did not want to listen to anything that I had to say. And, you know, it was definitely a their way or the highway type of day. Now, for me, I was in a state of absolute frustration by about 9:30 this morning, and it persisted, that emotional state, for longer than I'm proud to admit. But I actually had the ABCs of behavior play out for me today. My kid was not listening to me. And in response to that, I found myself really using more reprimands than I'm proud of. So my kid wouldn't listen, and I was laying it on them. And I had to stop myself and look at the pattern of behavior that was emerging. There were some moments, definitely, where I would tell my kiddo to do something, and she would. And when she would listen to me and she would do it, I, in my head, was having some mental snark. I was saying things to myself like, about time she listened. She needed to start listening, and this is what was going on inside of my head. But the actions coming out of my mouth were basically nothing. When she would listen, I'd be like, not really respond to her. In my head, I was like, good, it was about time you listened. I hope I'm admitting this all the way, that I'm admitting this in the spirit of like parental camaraderie. And you're not judging me too hard for this. So when she would be non-compliant, I was not effectively punishing. And in fact, I was reinforcing. She would be non-compliant and I would give her attention. The attention was a reprimand. It wasn't great quality attention. She probably didn't like it, but still, she would be non-compliant and I would provide attention in the form of a reprimand. Non-compliant, attention. Non-compliant, attention. What was happening over the course of a couple of hours is this non-compliance was increasing. And when she would happen to be compliant or to listen to what I was saying, I was effectively ignoring her. And I had to notice that. And I had to flip the script really hard. I had to, even though I did not mean it in my soul, I had to notice when she was a listener and pump her up and give her some high fives and say, like, I noticed your attitude. I noticed you listening. Thanks so much for that. Don't think I didn't see it. I saw what you did there. That was really cool. I had to really start to pair this behavior with attention. So instead of giving all the attention to not listening, I had to give it to listening. So she would listen and I would provide attention. Listen, provide attention. Listen, provide attention. And I was able to kind of shift it over time. I was able to start to get more compliance, more listening out of her because I was effectively reinforcing it. So again, I hope it was okay. I shared that with you all, but this slide was like a light bulb for me today, and to realize that just because we're doing distance learning doesn't mean that the actual behavior is any different and not governed by these same important principles. Okay, now let's get into some of these antecedent tips. Okay, so again, the antecedents are things that you do to set the stage. So I just glanced at my clock, by the way, and I'm sorry for all this yammering. I'm going to move through these next couple slides pretty quickly so that way at the end we can get to the good stuff and have time for questions. Okay, first and foremost, a schedule. Having a visual schedule for your kids, no matter what the age, is really important. Having it big enough that they can see it, even from afar, that they can know what's coming, is great to set the stage for distance learning. For our younger kids, some of our older kids too, but particularly for our younger kids, having a moving indicator, so either crossing things out, we have ours set up with a magnet and you can move that magnet along as they're changing tasks, letting them know where they are in the schedule and what's to come is really, really important. Rules and expectations. In schools, many teachers are really great about posting visual classroom rules or expectations so that the kids have it at the ready all the time. Sometimes this is with pictures, sometimes it's with words, but nonetheless, there are visual cues of what is expected. Many of us do not do this at the home, but we should have visually posted rules and expectations for distance learning. In whatever space our kids do distance learning, just like they have those visual cues at school. The workspace, where our kids are doing work, we all have kind of constraints on this, but to the extent that we can, we want to have a space that's free of distractions or at least minimize distractions. It is not a good idea to have your workstation in the same room with a TV running. You're setting the stage for struggle instead of setting the stage for being able to attend to work. So the more that we can have a distraction-free environment, the better. Timers can be a huge boon to our kiddos. You can buy I can't think of what the word I want, like the salt timers with the sand timers, there it is, or digital timers that have a countdown, but letting kids know how long do I need to persist at this present activity. For so many of our kids, it just feels like an eternity. And when it's something that they don't like, an eternity is too long, frankly. But knowing that it's not actually an eternity, it's 3 more minutes, can sometimes get us just a little bit more. Having planned breaks. Many of the schools have some planned breaks for the kids, which is fantastic, or they have at least some asynchronous time. But some of our kids need breaks more frequently than what the school's providing. And letting kids know that, if they can persist for 3 more minutes, they can have a couple of minutes of downtime. and maybe we stretch those intervals longer and longer to try to match up eventually with the school schedule, fantastic. But at the end of the day, we have got to let our kids know that they have some breathing room coming up. When our kids are doing asynchronous time or break time, the use of transitional warnings can be really helpful. Transitional warnings are essentially when we provide the countdowns for our kids, because so many of our kids do not have internal developmental clocks. So 3 minutes means nothing, or is no different than 30 minutes. And so saying to kids like, you have 4 minutes until you have to be back in class. Hey, this is your warning. You got 2 minutes till you have to be back in class. You have 1 minute till you have to be back in class. Now it's time to be back in class. Not as nags, not as being nagging, but just as like factual, neutral points of information over time can have a positive effect on engagement. The next tip, the next antecedent-based tip, is a strategy called a when-then. For those of you that are really into behavior analysis, it's called a Premack principle, but it's way easier to remember as a when-then. A when-then is when you say this more desirable thing that you want comes after this less desirable thing that you want. So when you eat your vegetables, then you can earn dessert. You just transfer that to school. So when you finish this activity right here, then you earn a break, or then you earn iPad time, then you earn outside time, then you earn whatever the more desirable activity is. It is not, by the way, like when you finish your math, then you can get to clean in that bathroom you haven't gotten to in a week. That's not a when then. A when then is when you do this less desirable activity, then you get the more desired outcome. And then lastly, having a healthy, trusting connection with others. I'm going to talk about this a lot more in a few minutes, so I'm just breezing past it now, but in and of itself is an antecedent to more kind of engaged distance learning. Okay, consequences. I talked a moment ago about the difference between reinforcers and punishment. Big take-home message for you. Reinforcement is far more powerful than punishment. The combination of the two, pretty effective, but most of us, and I don't know what this says about us as people, but most of us tend to rely more on punishment-based strategies. And on the whole, they are less effective in motivating and changing behavior than rewards and reinforcement. Rewards and reinforcement, particularly reinforcement, is way more powerful in shifting behavior and maintaining behavior. So by this, I mean, these can be tangible things like a sticker, a star, a special visual token. Can also be nonverbals like the winks, the finger guns, if that's a thing in your family, high fives. One of our most powerful reinforcements is labeled praise. Labeled praise is when you state the actual behavior that you are noticing and attach some positivity to it. Like, I see you studying right there. That's awesome. It makes me really proud that you're pushing through this, even though it's harder for you. I see that you're working, and I think that's really cool. Nice job finishing up that assignment. Those are all examples of labeled praises. One other thing that I just wanted to note is that sometimes it can feel like all these efforts that we're putting in are for naught, that our kids are really trying to just like push our buttons or get out of work. And when that's the case, that's something really important to take note of. No matter what praise and rewards we might have in place for work completion, if the kids are trying to get out of work, sometimes their misbehaviors are what we call escape motivated or avoidance motivated. They are, when they get out of work because they go into a timeout or they lose access to something, they actually ended up getting what they wanted. They might not even be conscious of this, but it's something important for us to be conscious of as parents, and to make sure that when we set up behavior plans or we try to shift the dynamic, that we take notice of, do my kids' disruptions come in a seemingly linked way when they're trying to get out of something? And if so, can I plan around that? Okay, forgive me for the increased speed with my voice, but I am realizing I'm going a little long. Okay, so some general tips. These are the last couple slides. This is going to feel a little bit more psychological or mental health focused than some of the earlier slides did on behavior, but that's because I'm a psychologist, and This is how my brain works. So I want to pass it along to you. First thing, control and prediction are really important things for mental health and wellness. And living in a pandemic, we have neither control or the ability to predict a lot of what's going on, like big picture in the world. And that is really stressful for a lot of people. So take this concept, control matters. Being able to predict matters. This matters for mental health, and try to provide opportunities for our kids to have some prediction. That's why I was saying, like, use a visual schedule. Let them know what's coming. It's a way to predict what's next. Give them some control over the things they can have control over. Little bits of subtle control can go a long way towards mental wellness, especially when the big picture is out of control. Also, convey a sense of trust and dependability through your words and your behaviors. Again, now that kids cannot predict. Don't be another thing in their life that they cannot predict. The more you can follow through, the more your kids can come to depend on you to be a stable force with your behavior, a stable thing that they can trust, the more mental wellness they are likely to have. The more that we are unpredictable as parents, and the more that we are another thing, another variable in their life they can't control, we may be unintentionally contributing to their stress. And we want to do the opposite of that. We want to convey trust with our words and trust with our actions. Another big tip, emotions matter. They matter a lot. And some families and some kids are just not good at verbalizing it. A huge thing that you can do with your kid, whether they seem happy or whether they seem angry, is to start to label their feelings. And that might feel weird at first, but it has the impact of validation on people. So when people are like just acting out, being able to say, like, you seem really angry. I can tell that you are upset. It's like communicating, like, I see you. For better or for worse, I see you. And I want you to put yourselves in shoes of a past fight. Have you ever like been in an argument or in a state of like being disgruntled with another person, and you can't move past it? Like, you cannot get past it to the problem solving because you're like, you don't even get me. This is a strategy for that in a nutshell. When people feel like their emotions are not understood, they can't move on to flexibility and thinking, and they can't move on to problem solving because their brains are like, no, you don't even get me in the first place. So it doesn't matter whether you agree with their emotion, but communicating to our kids that, like, yeah, distance learning is really frustrating. I would be mad too if I was in your shoes. It completely sucks. If that's how your kid is feeling, is powerful. And acknowledging that and taking a beat and letting the validation sit there before you say, but even though it sucks, it's what we're dealt with right now. And it's what we have to deal with. It is our problem to solve. Matters more than just being like, get over it, we just got to do it. Taking the time to acknowledge those emotions, to recognize that emotions matter to our kids is important. Along that line, relationships matter. And it might seem funny that I'm talking about this in the context of distance learning, but all the other relationships in your kid's life, their peer relationships and their teacher relationships, are probably taking a hit right now. So the more that we can do to shore up their connection with us in a really meaningful way is going to protect them against those other hits, those other stressors. And so I challenge you right now to ask yourself, not the question of when is the last time I spent time with my kid, because many of us would be like, when have I not spent time with my kid? I'm around them constantly because we don't leave the house that much. But instead, ask yourself, when's the last time I spent real undivided time with my kid, child-led, where I'm not trying to accomplish anything, teach anything. There's no incidental learning happening. I'm just there, engaged with them. And if it takes you more than a few seconds to answer that, it's time to spend some special time with your kids, because having that connection is critical. We are asking our kids right now to be really resilient, but resilience depends on relationships. And I'm going to get into this more in our last and final slide. But a lot of us think of resiliency as an internal personality trait. It is not. The science actually does not agree with that statement at all. Resiliency is the function of a system. I'm going to go ahead and go to our next slide. Resiliency is the capacity, the function of a system. So it is not individual, but it's how is the system working. And when a system is working well, an individual can be resilient to a lot of hits or a lot of stressors. We are wired for resilience, but it is a function of support. And so when you look at the system around your child, when they don't have as much support socially, they don't have as much support from extended family if they're at a distance, they don't have as much support from school, you have to shore up the support they have from you. So think of resiliency as a system. And when any part of the system takes a hit, we got to balance it out. We got to make sure that it doesn't get way unweighted. I'll work my way back up the slide, and then I promise you I will stop and stay close to time here. Okay. Along with that, I wanted to talk very briefly about some really interesting work that a researcher by the name of Anne Maston does. And she is, as I was just talking about, a resiliency researcher. But she has coined this term called surge capacity to kind of understand our response to stress. And one thing that's really important to note is that as people, we are pretty wired and pretty kind of built for short-term stressors. We are good at overcoming short-term stressors from a physiological standpoint, but we are not good from a physiological standpoint at long-term or chronic stress. And for many of our kids that had special learning needs or special communication needs, they already were in a position of having some chronic stress. This hit of distance learning, for those that it is a hit, it's stressing the system even more. So burnout is a real thing, not just for parents, but for kids too. And so we really have to think about kids as being part of a system. And if we want them to be able to function with distance learning, which is already maybe a little bit of a stressor for them, we have got to do our best to strengthen the rest of the system, to protect them, to provide bolstering to them. So we have to strengthen everything else that we can if we want them to be able to keep functioning in a resilient way. And if we look at our kids as a system, so they got school and extended family and friends and you and maybe siblings, and all these things are taking a hit, then we have to say, we got to revamp the system if we want to have a positive distance learning outcome. And you may end up coming away from this saying, like, who cares about distance learning at the moment? We got a hit to the system, and that's okay too. But since this webinar is about distance learning, I gotta talk about, if we want kids to have the mental flexibility to be able to shift with distance learning, to be able to still receive information in a meaningful way, we can't have them completely stressed in all these other areas of their life. We have to say there is a limit to their surge capacity. So they can only be pushed so far. And we have to kind of strike this balance between protecting them, giving them some freedoms where we can, letting them have some control, letting them have some flexibility, but kind of shoring up everything else in their life so that they even have the capacity to function well academically in a distance learning environment. And with that, I'm going to let you kind of read the monitoring tips there, but I know I've already gone far over, and I wish I hadn't, because I could keep talking to you all forever. But I'm going to pause now and take comments or take questions. which by the way, I can't see. So Truman, if you could help me with that, I would appreciate it.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that that download of information. Lots of lots of relevant stuff.
Probably in
Applause.
retrospect a little too much information, but hopefully it was useful to folks.
Absolutely. So it doesn't look like we have any outstanding, like any questions in chat right now. But yeah, if there's anything else you want to mention,
Yeah. Well, and I think what I'll close with are some of these takeaways, see if any questions come in. What can often happen with webinars is that people will watch them later and come up with questions later. And if that's the case, I strongly, strongly encourage you to contact OBC, to either contact your therapist or your behavior therapist, your speech therapist, whomever it is your point of contact, and let them know, hey, some questions came up from this webinar and I would be happy to talk with you directly or to pass along that information. But also there are some amazing clinicians and therapists at OBC. So even if I'm not directly accessible to you, I'm sure you can get a lot of these upcoming questions answered. And as far as takeaways, when you're leaving here, what I hope you can remember is that there are both advantages and disadvantages of distance learning. Load up on those antecedent-based strategies to set kids up for success. To keep in mind, this can be an opportunity for growth. Relationships matter, emotions matter, monitoring, which we didn't talk about, also matters too. And then lastly, resiliency isn't a personality trait, it's a function of a system. So make sure you're monitoring the system of a kid and kind of keeping balance where you can. The more balance we keep, the more likelihood we have for effective ability to learn academically.
Right.
Well, thank you all so much for having me and for joining this webinar. I really appreciate it. And again, please reach out to OBC with any upcoming questions that you have.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.